Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Hanaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, who is an advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, joining us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Naf, and good evening from Israel. It was a historic week, not just in Israel, but in the region, not necessarily from Israel's point of view for all the good reasons. Obviously, the biggest events didn't happen in Israel. They happened elsewhere in the Middle East with the historic visit, the first foreign visit, if you discount the Pope's funeral, by President Donald Trump during his second term. Similar actually to one of his first trips to Saudi Arabia in his first term. This time he went to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Israel was not on the agenda. It was not part of the agenda, was not invited to take part, and really, apparently, it wasn't even really updated on many of the things that happened during the week. There is a saying, I know former Secretary of State Antony Blinken once used it, that says that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that was a feeling felt by many Israeli officials this week. They felt that the Trump administration, President Trump himself, would hear many things that Israel didn't want to hear, see many things that Israel didn't want to see. And basically, there was only one sort of narrative, and that was not necessarily one particularly friendly to Israel, especially in places like Qatar and perhaps even Saudi Arabia. So this week really was a difficult week for Israel, watching a President Trump that many, especially in this government and its supporters, had put a lot of support in and felt that this was a new situation, that President Biden, although supportive, not supportive enough, and they were waiting for President Trump, well, this week will certainly have put a certain dampener on many feelings of government supporters towards the US president. Obviously, there's lots of different and complex explanations, but certainly the honeymoon, let's say, period between, if there was even a honeymoon, at least it seemed like that visually, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, seems to be a little bit over, at least on some very important arenas. First of all, it's clear that the US were involved in indirect talks with Hamas. I mean, it's an open secret. It's been going on for quite a while. But what they were able to do this week in releasing Israeli-American soldier Idan Alexander was really, although it was welcomed in Israel by everybody really welcomes any single hostage that is returned to Israel. It was a very difficult and complex event for Israel for a number of reasons. First of all, Idan Alexander was captured as an Israeli soldier. Yes, he grew up in the US. He's a dual citizen, but it's clear that Israel played no role in this. He was chosen, or his release was secured purely because of his American citizenship, and that's something that troubled many in Israel, because basically it sort of prioritized foreign citizens. Some Israeli commentators even went as far as to say it's a real dig at Zionism, because it will mean that future soldiers will be rushed to consulates around Israel by their parents before they go into war, or before they go into service, to try and get the second citizenship that could help them in a worst case scenario that they were captured. But the fact is that it's clear that this was all American pressure. Idan Alexander was released purely because of his American passport. There were some last minute, Israel again was not party to this. They did find out some of the information, part of it not directly from the Americans, through intelligence means. What they tried to do at the last minute was try to get the release of at least one more hostage, an Israeli hostage, to show that there was no hierarchy, no prioritization of foreign citizens, that Israelis are just as important as those who hold dual citizenships. Unfortunately, they were not successful in that. Idan Alexander was released. There was no disgraceful, disgusting ceremony. Again, showing that Hamas wanted to please Donald Trump, wanted to please the American administration, perhaps in conjunction with the Qatari hosts. But the fact is that this was, again, a wonderful moment, a very important moment. A hostage was released, but certainly one that showed that the Israelis, who's the boss in town, who's the one that can get things done, and who's more important for them. Other major events that Israel, again, really was just on the sideline watching, from the outside watching in, is, the American president accepted, as we now know, the famous $400 million jet, sold Boeing planes to the Qatari Air Force, is close perhaps to a deal with Iran. There's still a great amount of worry. That's the biggest worry in Israel, exactly what a potential deal would look like. President Trump sounds enthusiastic, sounds positive, but the wording that they're using still pleases Jerusalem, that there should be no enrichment within Iran. That's a bit of a walk back from some of the statements earlier on, that there could be some limited enrichment. Israel knows a limited enrichment leads to unlimited enrichment. That's what happened under the JCPOA, and the Iranians have been cheating ever since. And so if you give them an inch, they will literally take a mile. So the Israelis were successful to a certain extent, or maybe not just Israelis, others, in pushing the American administration to, at the moment at least, verbally call for no enrichment. The Iranians, as we know, have denied that. They said that it's their right and they will not sign any deal that doesn't allow them to enrich on their own sovereign territory. I did hear this week, I have no way of knowing if this is true, or I'm sure there is a way of knowing, but I haven't really checked, that there is no country with a civil nuclear program that doesn't import from elsewhere. And that's a point I think that Witkoff made, that if Iran is serious about a civil nuclear program, it could clearly have it imported from elsewhere. It does not need to enrich on its own territory. The fact that the president is so positive about an agreement, with the Iranians saying that we will not sign an agreement without allowing us to enrich, gives many in Israel pause for thought. And that's certainly one to watch over. And that's probably the major issue at the moment that Israel has, perhaps potentially, with the Americans. The Americans also, as we know, made a deal with the Houthis, the terrorist group that's basically controlling much of Yemen today. They made a deal that if they stop shooting in the shipping lanes, then the Americans will stop their bombardment. That happened. Israel, again, was not forewarned about this, found out about this when it was released. And of course, as we know, Israel was not part of it, and the Houthis have been shooting at Israel ever since. Interestingly enough, while in Israel we like to think everything is very Israel focused, and we try and look at everything through the lens, it's not just an Israel issue. Apparently, the British defense establishment, which has been helping the Americans in an international coalition against the Houthis, were also not informed. And apparently, the defense secretary of the UK, British defense secretary, was also apparently extremely angry at not being let in on this deal. So it's not just about Israel. Perhaps the most disturbing thing, except obviously a possible Iran deal at this point, is a real breakdown of another Israeli conception. There had been this belief, especially by this current government, that Saudi would get what it wants from the Americans only through a normalization deal. In other words, Jerusalem held a lot of the cards for Saudi Arabia's request from America to have a civil nuclear program, to have an arms trade, to have a defense pact, all these sort of goodies that it wanted. And there was a feeling that it could get it, but only once that they agreed to normalize relations with Israel. Well, we saw while Saudi Arabia didn't get everything they want, they got a lot. And they paid no price towards Israel. And that was something that stunned a lot of people in Jerusalem, because there had been this conception that this simply wouldn't happen unless the Israel element was in. So Israel's completely out. Saudi Arabia's got a lot of what it wanted, not everything, but it's clear now to the Saudis, as it is clear to other potential Abraham Accords signees in the future, that you don't need to go through Jerusalem to get things from the American administration. That was the belief earlier on, but clearly this week that completely evaporated, and Israel's leverage has to a certain extent evaporated. Israel, as I said, was very concerned about this meeting, about this trip. It sent Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, as we've said many times, very, very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, ahead of the meeting to visit President Trump in the White House, spoke to him about Israel's concerns. It doesn't seem that it seems like it fell to a certain extent on deaf ears. While President Trump will say that Israel will gain a lot from this trip, it's clear that Israel was out of the loop and certainly to a certain extent on the menu. On Gaza, Israel again is talking about a major ground offensive. There has been a lot of talk that it would only happen when President Trump leaves the region. And until he leaves the region, there's a possibility of an agreement to slow it down, to halt it temporarily, but not to stop it completely. But it seems at the moment that there is some movement, but not enough movement. Hamas is still demanding an end of the war. Netanyahu has said that he's prepared for a temporary cessation, but that's all it will be. He will not stop the war. He's glad to take 10 hostages or whatever it is, but he will not stop the war. It is clear that the Americans are trying to put enormous pressure. They know that, there are tanks massing at the border. There's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of reservists and soldiers who are ready to go in. Plans have been approved. It will be a different type of plan. It would be a far more powerful invasion than before. It would not just conquer territory, but retain the territory once it's conquered, and not just remove itself and allow Hamas to rearm and reestablish itself. There is a big debate in Israel whether that is a bluff or a trying to push Hamas into a corner, or it's a serious plan. My feeling is it is a serious plan, but they do want to try and get a deal that would delay it to a certain extent for it. But what is certainly moving towards is that Israel is being seen as an obstacle to what Trump wants to achieve in the region, rather than being a help. It's seen as a hindrance. I'm sure wherever he went in the region, whether it is Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and meeting with the Syrian president elsewhere, they all would have spoken about the need to end the Gaza war. And it's clear that that's something that Donald Trump has sought. The language he's used recently is far stronger. He wants the war to end as soon as possible. Before he talked on more vague terms and allowed Israel a lot of latitude. Not to say he's going to prevent Israel from invading, but it's clear that the tone has changed, and it's clear that the Trump administration would like there to be a deal, and then perhaps there could be some sort of grand bargain that involves perhaps normalization, perhaps even, as there was talk of Syria becoming involved in the Abraham Accords. I think that's a little bit premature, but that's what certainly people are speaking about. What's happening in the Trump administration? Again, I'm not an expert in US politics, but it does seem to be a movement from a more hawkish, traditional Republican point of view to a more isolationist, America First, MAGA point of view, where it's about making the best deal for America. If, as J.D. Vance said before the elections, if Israel and America's interests are in sync, great. If they're not, then we'll do what's right for America. And that's clearly what seems to be taking precedence at the moment. And that's something which has certainly knocked Netanyahu a little bit because he did not expect it. Clearly, he did not see it. And I was in the Knesset this week speaking to people in the coalition and the opposition, and they are shocked to a person how badly Bibi read the map this week. And it's clear that his visage is Mr. America. I understand America. I work with Republicans. They're my people. Has taken a massive knock. So we'll have to wait and see. A lot will be told if a deal is made. If a deal is made, it's clear that the Americans have piled a lot of pressure on. Some are calling it a decision between Bibi has to make a decision between Trump and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. In other words, between the pressure of Trump and the continuation of his coalition, because if a deal is made, there is a chance that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will leave the coalition, which will leave him short of a majority and thus susceptible to the collapse of his government and new elections, which is certainly something he doesn't want at this point in time. On another note, within the coalition, there's another threat. Again, I don't think it's necessarily an immediate threat, but the ultra-Orthodox elements within the government have heightened the sanctions against the government because of their perceived slight that that there hasn't been a law which would make it legal for ultra-Orthodox youths not to go to the army, which, as we know, is not the case today. They're very angry. They say that they want a law by Shavuot, which is about 2 or 3 weeks from now, and if not, that they will leave the government. We've heard that threat half a dozen times since the beginning of this whole crisis with the ultra-Orthodox enlistment. Perhaps this time there'll be something more. I still don't see it happening, and if Bibi, as we've spoken many times before, can make it through this summer session, and then with the summer vacation and then the Jewish holidays, he's got a bit of space to deal with other problems. Finally, on a positive note, it does seem, at least there is optimism within Israel's security services, that they were able to take out Muhammad Sinwads, brother of Yahya Sinwar, who apparently is ostensibly the Hamas leader today, perhaps even with Hamas military spokesperson Abu Ubaidah and the head of the Rafah brigade. If this is true, if these 3 people were killed this week in the IDF attack on the European hospital, which is where Hamas had set up one of their major headquarters, then this would be probably the most significant assassination since the beginning of the war, even more arguably than Yahya Sinwar himself, because these are 3 major figures, not just in the Palestinian theater, but in the Arab world. And there is a lot of speculation that one of the obstacles to a deal has been Muhammad Sinwar, who is on the far more hawkish part of the Hamas terrorist organization. So we haven't got confirmation of that yet. There is optimism within the Israeli security services that they did manage to kill him, but perhaps we'll get that confirmation in the hours, maybe days ahead. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey, thank you very much, Ashley. I will begin with a question here from David Levine, who asks, Trump has proposed massive sales of the most advanced American weaponry to the Gulf states. Knowing that these autocratic governments are not popular and could be overthrown by Islamists who yearn for Israel's destruction, what is Israel's response?
Well, I don't think any of these states at this point in time are really threatened by Islamists. Of course, each one has its own character. But what is perhaps more worrying at this point is that there's always been this idea that while Israel, the US would sell arms to many other parties in the region, many Arab parties, perhaps even, because they have larger populations, larger territories, then they would have a certain quantitative edge. Israel would always have a qualitative edge. It would get the latest technology. It would get the, air supremacy or whatever it is. There is a concern that might be ebbing away. Not to say that there is any air force in the region that can match Israel's, but certainly this whole concept of a qualitative edge took a bit of a hit. Another hit, which I didn't mention during my opening remarks, but certainly, again, something that really worries not just the Israeli political establishment, but also the Israeli military establishment, because, as you said, no one knows what tomorrow will bring. Whether there will be peace with certain countries in the region, things are moving so quickly. Just look at Syria, just look at Lebanon. One never knows what tomorrow will bring. And also, alliances are made and broken very quickly, but the hardware that is sold by the US will remain in the hands of whoever leads and whoever makes alliances. Just look at Turkey as an example. So certainly that's another concern in Jerusalem this week, watching all those sales.
Great, thank you. Now, speaking of Syria, during President Trump's visit to the Middle East, he met with Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, and who we know is, of course, a jihadist, although a jihadist in an expensive suit. And he discussed lifting the sanctions on Syria and sort of implicitly was giving them some sort of legitimacy. Now, how does Israel see this, and how do groups like Hamas and PIJ see this interaction?
Well, first of all, it's not clear. I mean, Trump did say that he will lift the sanctions on Syria, and that was welcomed in Saudi Arabia, in the Arab world, and certainly in Syria itself. But there are some stipulations that they have to meet, allegedly. Again, one never knows. Sometimes President Trump says something and then has to walk it back, or sometimes there are still criteria to be met. But he did say that he will lift sanctions. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an explicit statement. But then also, interestingly, in a sort of, one of these impromptu statements to journalists on Air Force One, he spoke about his meeting and said that he wanted to press Syria into the Abraham Accords, but first you have to deal with your own stuff. I don't know if I'm quoting verbatim, but something along those lines. So, and then when he was asked, was Giuliani in favor of it? He said, yes, he thinks he is. In Israel, at this point in time, there is still grave concern about the Syrian leadership. Israel does see the Syrian leadership really as unrepentant terrorists, jihadis. It wasn't a long time ago that he was in a ISIS-affiliated organization. Yes, he has done a bit of a charm offensive, as you said. He's had, I don't know how expensive his suits are, but suits nonetheless, rather than army fatigues or the ISIS gear that he wore before. But it's clear that his charm offensive is working. It is supported by Saudi Arabia, which is very important. And that's probably what facilitated the meeting. Israel has expressed its concern about the Syrian leadership on more than one occasion to the Americans. Interestingly, again, President Trump, in one of his more flippant remarks, said, I don't care if Israel and Turkey divide up Syria. So it's sort of unclear exactly what this all means, but it's clear that the Syrian leadership has been given the stamp of approval. He's been welcomed by major world Western leaders, but Israel is still trying to note that caution, still trying to say this is not someone that we should take our eyes off yet. Bring out the examples of what it's tried to do against the Jews, against the Christians, against the Alawites, against other groups, and some of his supporters are certainly not the most Western of liberals. So Israel, again, I'm just adding to the list of concerns that Jerusalem had this week. Certainly, the pleasant meeting and the call for the end of sanctions by President Trump is just another addition to that relatively long list.
Thank you. Now, Merdad Konsari asks, do you perceive any scenario where Israel might act unilaterally against its enemies without American benediction?
Well, that's a tough one to ask because different enemies require different tactics. Gaza, I think, yes, it would launch an attack on Gaza. I don't think it's a matter of, again, as much as Israel sort of expressed concern about America's actions, part of this worldview, I think, from the Trump administration is if it doesn't affect us, go ahead and do it. If there is no deal and Hamas go and invade, go do what you need to do, but finish it as quickly as possible. So I don't think the Trump administration, as I said before, are looking for an Israeli invasion. They would prefer the whole war to stop. But they would be a greater understanding. On Iran, I don't see any possibility while talks are taking place that America would green light or even amber light an Israeli attack. And let's not fool ourselves here. While Israel could certainly do a certain amount of damage on its own, it needs American support. Every time it's attacked Iran before, it has needed certain things from the Americans. Americans haven't, dropped any bombs on Iran alongside the Israelis, but there are certain things that Israel needs, whether it's flyover rights, whether it's assistance if anyone should need rescuing. There are certain things that Israel asks of the Biden administration before each and every attack on Iran. And so I'm not sure that Israel would be able to or want to attack Iran without the American blessing. And it just seems at this point in time, Netanyahu is a little bit cornered, because it's one thing to go against Obama and Biden when you can go to the Republican Party. Now you can't go to Republicans, you can't go to the Democrats, you can't address the joint House of Congress, you can't do all these things that were in Bibi's playbook throughout the years. He's a bit cornered because Trump is basically, again, this week has shown that he's the boss in town. And that's what I heard from a lot of people in the Knesset as well. There's a saying here, Balabait, the sort of the owner, the boss. And they said this week we learned who's really in charge. Bibi Netanyahu will do some things, but it's clear that he's nervous about offending Donald Trump. He hasn't come out with any, as one commentator said this week, if this was Biden, Netanyahu would be releasing statements against him every day this week and getting his allies in Congress and other decision makers and opinion shapers to be writing articles to come out against the administration. He's not doing that. He can't do that. He's not even leaking displeasure as it's sometimes what the Israeli government does when it wants to show its displeasure, but not too openly. So it's clear that Netanyahu is in a difficult situation with this. But I think that probably wouldn't prevent it from entering Gaza. But on further afield, on Iran, yes, I think that it certainly, Israel probably wouldn't attack Iran without American, not just American blessing, but American support.
All right, thank you. Now, I think we have time for one more here. So I will go to a question from Eric Selkov, who asks, how will Muhammad Sinwads' death affect the hostage negotiations?
Well, first of all, it remains to be seen if he is dead. As I said, there's cautious optimism in Israel. There have been many who have said that, like his brother, he was on the sort of more hawkish side. And let's be honest, we're talking about a terrorist organization here. But there are some who in Hamas who would accept a deal if they were exiled and they went to live somewhere else and they had no role in Gaza post-war. The Sinwar brothers are certainly not part of that. They are not prepared to move an inch, not prepared to make any deal. Logically, it makes sense. Let's not forget the 20 alive hostages, and I think 30 odd dead hostages are the only leverage they have. They're the only hand they have to play. So they're not going to give them up unless they get their ultimate dream, which is the end of the war, Israel to remove itself. And while they wouldn't officially stay in power, they would pretty much stay as they were in the Strip.
All right. Thank you very much, Ashley. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our podcast for today. I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please join us this Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a podcast on Israel and the woke right with Karis Rea. And of course, that following week, If you are already registered, I would love to see you all at the Middle East Forum's 2025 Policy Conference, Statecraft Reimagined in Washington, D.C. If you're there, please come up and say hi to me. I would love to meet all of you. As always, I thank you all for your viewership and your participation in this podcast, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.